welcome to Incorruptible Mass. Our mission here is to help you transform state politics. And we know that together we can make Massachusetts policy reflect the needs of the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful state. So today we are going to be talking about why you, yes, you, the listener out there with your headphones in your ears, should be working on state politics, not just national, not just local, but state. And we are going to cover why you can be able to pass national type policies for millions of people, how it costs a tiny fraction of what national costs, how many other national policies, both here and other countries, have passed first at the state level. And we'll even cover at the end why you should work on state politics here in Massachusetts and not just in any random state. But before we do, I would love to introduce my indomitable co-hosts. I will start with Jonathan Cohn.
Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his, joining from Boston, and have been active in different campaigns here in Massachusetts for almost a decade, which is a wild thing to think of.
Woo! And Jordan Berg Powers.
Jordan Berg Powers, he, him, and I have about 13 years experience in electoral politics in Massachusetts. And
I am Anna Callahan. She, her, coming at you from Medford. Been doing state politics for a few years for sure. And before we go on, I have to say that this weekend, my mind was blown by something called the Puppy Bowl. I had never heard of this before. It was some sort of miracle happening on the television at an event I was at. And it was a truly beautiful thing. And I know, Jordan, it had meaning for you this year.
Yes, I do. We love the Puppy Bowl in our household. It is standard to watch the Puppy Bowl before the Super Bowl in our household and treat it like it's the Super Bowl. So everyone gathers around to watch it together as a big family. Pizza's already out. We're ready to go. Puppy Bowl all the way.
Well, and now on to more political matters. We are going to go ahead and just for a couple of minutes, we're going to talk about state politics and why it matters. I know I talk to a lot of people who are, spend hours and hours and hours every week, every month, every year on national politics. We have great difficulty moving progressive policies forward in national politics. But I know many people who are really spending that time, totally appreciate it. And then I even know a lot of people doing local politics, but state politics is this thing that I call the forgotten level of politics, that for some reason, even people who move from that national politics focus into local politics, state politics, especially here in Massachusetts, it's not just that people don't think it's necessary. There's some sort of disconnect between what actually happens at the state politics level, or what could happen at the state politics level, and people who are deeply involved in their national and local politics are surprised to hear about the change that they could make if they worked in state politics. So we're going to spend some time basically talking about that. And I want to start with our personal stories and why each of the three of us ended up in state politics. And Jonathan, I want to start with you. How did you end up really feeling like state politics was a place where you wanted to spend some of your volunteer hours and your political brain?
Yeah, so I'd say I'll start with my first, because state politics connects to how I entered actually doing stuff in national politics, kind of interestingly, which was in 2012 in the summer after finishing grad school. And I've been following things before, but it wasn't particularly let's say engaged in volunteering in any capacity prior. But it was the summer after grad school, and I was back home in Philadelphia, and it was around the time where the Republicans in Harrisburg had passed a very stringent voter ID law because they wanted to restrict kind of who would be able to vote to help make elections in their favor, and that was something as well happening in a number of states. And that had made me think, well, if they're going to try to restrict who's able to vote, I should, since I have time now, spend my time helping to increase the total number of people who are going to vote, to turn out the voters that they clearly don't want showing up on election day. And that got me involved in campaigning in the first place. But the first one, that kind of first main campaign was one kind of at the national level, but both realized, one, that I enjoyed the work, but since the entry also came with seeing the damage that a state could do.
Mm.
And had also been seeing damage from the state in Pennsylvania around school funding debates in Philadelphia happening then. When I came to Massachusetts, I both immediately got involved in our mayoral race back in 2013, and then in state stuff thereafter, because it was 2014 was a big election year with a number of the statewide offices here kind of open, and that year I was an active volunteer for Don Berwick's campaign. I occasionally think about how much better our COVID response might have been if we had Don Berwick as our governor. Charlie Baker. But then that campaign as well, I think it was useful of all the different things that I had been following often at the national level, of wanting to hold candidates who are running at the state office about what they could be doing on those, about kind of things like single payer, kind of healthcare, things like having ambitious climate plans, kind of what their stances were kind of on a number of different issues. And then through that work, ended up getting involved with Progressive Mass, which had endorsed Don and got me kind of more and more involved. And I think my entry into actively following the legislature was actually in late 2016, when Harmony Wu, who was one of the former board members and original founders of Progressive Mass, had roped in a few of us into creating an issues committee for the organization. And that was what kind of led me to realize about what a kind of dysfunctional place the Massachusetts legislature was, but as well as how much was needed to happen. When you could see that the role that a blue state especially would play in how we should be in advance of what the national government is pushing at any given time, because we have the ability to do that. I remember having been particularly horrified several years prior when it was during the one time when Democrats were pushing to raise the minimum wage. I think it was just to $11 was the push at the time, back in 2013. In Maryland, which then still had a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature, was passing something weaker than what national Democrats were pushing, when they had the ability to do anything that they wanted and wanted to put it filled with carve-outs. And that as well was kind of an insight. It's no, if we want to have anything good happen at the national level, we need to be making sure that the states where we can do more are doing more.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this is always kind of influenced my attitude to stuff here, that if we can do more, because we have in theory the numbers, it's necessary to shape the outcomes in other states and on the federal level as well, simply improving the lives of people here, which is a good thing in of itself.
Absolutely. I love how you're talking about. First, you notice that hey, the other side is succeeding because they're working at the state level. Maybe we should work at the state level. And then you're focused also on democracy, which I know so many people and so many of our listeners are really concerned about, that at the state level is really, that's where things happen.
Yeah.
And a lot of these topics we're going to cover in future episodes as well. You're talking about all sorts of, conjoined issues, combined things that all intersect with state politics. But before we go on, I would love to switch over to Jordan. And Jordan, we'd love to hear your story of how did you get involved in state politics?
Yeah. So, I was a young kid and I started watching C-SPAN, as you do when you're 12 and 13. And and I wanted to get involved in politics. I had grown up sort of in the stories of my grandparents, mostly my grandfather, telling stories about the civil rights movement, and I wanted to do my part. And I started volunteering on political campaigns. Very fun, very funny. I started doing congressional campaigns, and somebody was like, "You should do this state senate campaign." I was like, I don't do state politics. I'm doing this, congressional campaigns. I really got into the mold that I think a lot of people who do politics do. And I remember that very vividly. And so I started, I went to DC like a lot of political people did for my college degree and my job. And I worked in and around the Democratic Party and in and around Capitol Hill. I had internships, I had jobs. I worked for political polling firms. I worked for fundraising consultants. I sort of did the breadth of the political consultancy world. And, I have lots of terrible stories. Many of them really centering around some of the racism and sexism I saw up close and personal among the consultancy class.
Mm.
I will say one that's gotten a lot better as people of color and younger people, millennials, have come into these positions and don't, sort of aren't recreating some of the problematic things I saw when I was younger. But, those are still out there, still dominating a lot of leftist politics. Um, and one of the things I tell people is that when I went to DC, I was really young and naive. I actually sort of laugh at how much I thought, look, all they have to do is pass a law and they can make people's lives better. I grew up around a lot of hopelessness, a lot of poverty, a lot of people I grew up with did not have the opportunities I had. I really hit the jackpot in terms of opportunities and in terms of things that were given to me that are totally unearned, right? I just happened to come out of the right person, and therefore those opportunities opened up. And that's not the way the world should work. It shouldn't work that I get lucky and my neighbors and my friends don't, simply because they don't have the right parents or the right opportunity, or they don't know the right people. And so, I carried that with me, and I thought national politics would be the place where people could go and make big change. And there's all these people in suits, and they're very serious, and politics takes itself very seriously. And at some point, you come to realize that the people who are political, and I will say not the politicians themselves often. We often put this on the elected officials, but my experience is that most of the elected officials I met on the national level were serious about making change in people's lives. It's that they ran up against a culture that tells them, ooh, not so fast, not so much, not so, everyone around them is telling them to stop, to slow down. There's a great Eddie Murphy movie called Distinguished Gentleman, which I think is the best movie I've ever seen about how politics works in DC. Everyone is telling you to not do it, to not work. And I started to realize that, of course, you can't make big change here. There's nobody pushing it from the ground up. There's nobody here having those conversations, and the people there aren't taken seriously. You start to realize when you're in DC a long time that the people in the suits are actually, they might as well be in clown suits. They're not serious. They're serious about being serious. They're serious about the trappings of politics. They're serious about the ups and the downs, the who's winning, the who's losing. They're serious about those things. They're serious about protecting the sort of formal Washington, the suits, the ties, the tuxes, the access. Those are the things they're serious about. But you know what they're not serious about? Helping you or me, making America work for everyone, having big, bold visions that get enacted. They are not serious about policy. And so what I realized is that the serious people were the people in regular clothing yelling at them to do something, to care about them. The people who are looked down on as not serious because they're not dressed apart, right? They're not in the right clown suit. Those were the serious people because they were serious about being frustrated and wanting things to get better for them and their kids and their families and their communities. And so I started to really become disillusioned. I actually left the country for a while over it. And what I came to realize is that, I studied more about how, I did a lot of reading about the progressive movements and how the progressive movement started. And I realized how young and naive and silly I was to believe that change happens from the top down. No, change happens from the bottom up, right? You get women's suffrage, you get the end to enslavement. All of these are ground up year after year slogs, and they take leadership in the states. States were electing women before women were allowed to vote, right? So we need to have that same impulse. And that's when I started to realize that state politics is really the place that change is going to happen. And then like Jonathan, I saw that Republicans had gotten this forever. Meanwhile, they're passing all their terrible ideas at state level. They're making it harder to unionize, harder to work. They're defunding schools. They're attacking education, right? In my
Abortion
life,
rights.
Pennsylvania went from a world-class education system to a terrible education system that's underfunded. That didn't happen because of because that happened because Republicans took over, and they had an idea that public education shouldn't work. It shouldn't. They're not interested in it working. They're interested in it failing, and they're interested in it telling kids of color where they belong. That's what they're interested in. And so, they broke Pennsylvania's education system. I experienced that, and it took later in life to understand it, right? To have a context for it. And so it's really, that work of the state level politics that started to coalesce for me later in life and led me to sort of apply for the job that I've had for a long time in working in state politics, right? It really is the place where we can and should be leading. And it's really clarified for me, and that in the studying how movements happen, that's how we're going to make change. We're going to have to make change from the state level and push, the federal government to make that change.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. It's, I mean, because you've really been there, not just, participating from as a volunteer from your home in your home state, but like been in DC and seen it for reals. So
yeah, we could do a whole podcast of all the ways DC's terrible.
Well, my story. Oh, sorry, Jonathan.
I was like escaping the swamp.
Escaping the swamp.
Yeah, exactly.
My story is one where I did get activated by national politics. I got activated in 2016 by the Bernie campaign. For everybody, it's something, right? For me, it was the Bernie campaign. And, but I almost immediately, as soon as that campaign was over, got incredibly interested in local level politics. I learned about this group in California, out of the city of Richmond, the Richmond Progressive Alliance, that did this amazing thing. They kind of took over the city council and they passed rent control and they passed a $15 minimum wage. This is in like 2010, right? Way back. And they passed they passed a ton of amazing things, really worker-focused policies and renter-focused policies, and it just was fantastic. And so I spent like 5 years going from state to state to state, city to city to city, training people to do this work. And I just had this deep conviction that doing the work at the local level is the place that, has the most impact and takes the least money. You can literally win a campaign with almost no money at all just by knocking on doors. And then you can change people's lives, even if it's only like, 40,000 people, 70,000 people, you can really change their lives. And then I had been living in California. You might have noticed that I said that in their city, they passed rent control, and that in their city, they passed a $15 minimum wage. Now, coming back to Massachusetts, because I had lived here before, then I was in California for about 2 years, came back here and started working at the local level. And it was quite a shock, I have to say, when I learned that you can't pass rent control at the city level here in Massachusetts. You cannot pass a minimum wage at the city level in Massachusetts. There's so many things that you are not allowed to pass if you are an elected city councilor. You cannot pass those things in your city because of our Constitution. You have to basically hand them, you have to pass the thing, and then you hand that bill to the state house, and then the state house makes a decision as to whether you're allowed to pass that bill or not. And sadly, most of the time, they say no. So, and all of the time that is rent control, they have to say no, right? So it was a shock to me that this local politics that I believed so much in was pretty impotent. That really you cannot change people's lives the way that you could in California and the way that you can in many states. So that's when I started really learning a lot about state politics here in Massachusetts, about the dysfunction at the state house and not just the state house and Senate. Like, let's be real, in most states, they're under public records laws. Almost every elected, body in the country is under public records laws, but not the state house, the state Senate of Massachusetts. They're too good for that. So supremely dysfunctional, and it prevents us from being able to pass the policies, even locally by elected officials in your towns, from passing the policies that their entire town wants. 80% policies that 80% of the people in their town want. They cannot pass that policy. So I just came to this. And then, of course, I learned about state politics and realized, oh my God, all these policies that matter so much to me, Medicare for all, and, environmental Green New Deal stuff, minimum wage laws, immigrant, like everything that I thought was important, that I thought could only be passed at the national level, we could pass those in Massachusetts for 7 million people. And it was this amazing kind of mind-blowing experience for me that I realized I have essentially a little nation of 7 million people that I can affect, that I can have real impact on right here. And that little mini country, we have vast agreement, over 50% agreement on all of the policies that matter to me. So why these are not passed here in Massachusetts is the question, right? And this is a question for other future podcasts that will be in terms of why those policies are not yet passed. But that was my sort of realization moment. And I don't know if you guys have a comment or two before we go on.
Yeah, no, I think that's I think it's similar to all of us, that we have this realization that there's things we can and should be doing. And obviously that's the first episode, right? It's the things we can and should be doing and have vision for, but aren't doing on the state. And in fact, the state isn't stopping from other people from doing, which is a certain galling thing. And I think it's also a reminder, we think about Florida and the way in which it stops localities from raising the minimum wage or from passing ordinances to protect folks. Same thing in Texas. But we have that embedded in our system. They don't have to pass a special law like they do in Florida to stop the minimum wage from being allowed to be, increased for Orlando, right? We just embed that and then it quietly doesn't happen. The state, the media never raises the question, why are all of these ordinances that are being passed locally not allowed to go forward? Why are they stifling the democratically elected change that people want, right? It's always happening to other people and other places, and it's never inward looking, like that's happening here.
Yeah. And by the way, if you're listening to this and you're relatively new to the podcast, we have covered a lot of this in season 4, but believe me, we are going to cover all of this for you again. So if you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, why? Well, what is this thing that Jordan is saying where it's built into the structure of our, state politics? Believe me, we're going to cover it. You're going to learn about it. But today we really are just talking about all the reasons why you, the listener, person listening to this right now, should be getting involved in state politics. And I would love to dig in a little bit on a few of these individual reasons. So let's talk about the idea, if there's anything left to say about the idea that we can pass national policies right here for 7 million people.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of why I bring it. Oh, Jonathan, you go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing I would just kind of emphasize with that I like to point out is how one of the core contrasts between here in Massachusetts and nationally is the numbers game. That right now we have to deal with a Republican House of Representatives, and even last year, when you still had when your road to a majority in the Senate had to run through somebody like Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema, you have to hold everybody in line. We looking simply at the letter next to it, a politician's names, we don't have that problem here in Massachusetts. And so that you can do a lot more.
And just to jump in on that, so in case people are new to the podcast, we have a 90% Democratic state Senate and an 85% Democratic state House, something like that.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit higher than that now. And I think those are about right. It's a little bit higher than that in the Senate. And I think that sounds pretty close to right for the House. Either way, it is far more than it is the second largest in the country after Hawaii.
Yeah.
And so that removes some of those structural obstacles, as well as the realization of how much exists at the state level in particular. When public education funding, a lot of that's local, but a lot of that is the state state aid provided to schools, especially to correct the inequalities on the local level. A public higher education system, that is at the state level.
Yes.
When it comes to, let's say, criminal legal reform, sentencing laws are much more of a state level issue than a federal one for a number of things. And the running of the state correctional facilities. is a state thing. When it comes to like a lot of the regulations that you can set on like on vehicles, around buildings, etc., or like on energy usage to help kind of accelerate a transition to renewable energy and will kind of reduce energy usage itself. A lot of that happens at the state level and can happen at the state level before it does nationally. And it's that kind of useful realization of on a number of things, like the state actually is a major actor, and the state can act before and in advance, like before and bolder than the national government.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love how you're running down these issues. It's like free public college, criminal justice reform, like bam, 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 bam. And the one I always have to mention is Medicare for all, because I was talking to a reporter who reports on state politics, and I mentioned Medicare for all at the state level, and they said, well, that would be a national policy. You're not going to pass that in Massachusetts, as if it is impossible to pass it in a state. And I was like, wow, even people who are deeply involved in politics don't think you can pass Medicare for all for 7 million people in Massachusetts. And you can. There are countries in Europe that have less than 7 million people that have passed this 50 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's because it's always a reminder for folks. Massachusetts, if it were a country, would be one of the largest GDPs, and it would be one of the top performing countries. We would be in like the G8, G7. I don't know if we're there, but we're not far away, right? Like we're not some small place. We have a lot of money in this state, and countries that have far less money figure out how to tax people a little bit and spread the money around so that everybody can get access to a doctor when they're sick.
Yeah,
it's just not that difficult to do. And it certainly costs, and it would cost us individually and as a collective less than we're currently spending, because so much money goes to an entity, health insurance companies, that do literally nothing except
administration and profit.
Siphon off. Siphon off money from the system for their own profits.
So great. So for sure, if you are interested in a policy like these, if this is why you're involved in national politics, is to pass these policies, think about Massachusetts. I would love to hear you guys talk a little bit about cost. I'm going to just bounce it to you guys because I know you guys know the numbers and everything. What does it cost to run a congressional campaign? And what does it cost to run a state rep campaign? I know a little bit about it, having run for state rep. What does it cost to run a senatorial campaign? And what does it cost to run a state senator campaign?
Yeah, I mean, a congressional campaign will cost you anywhere from $1 million to $3 million. A Senate campaign will cost you, again, $1 million to $3 million, if not more, 4, 5, 6 million. A state rep campaign, you could win it with $50,000, $60,000 pretty easily. And just by comparison too, just to other states like California state rep rates like $1 million. Texas has no limit on how much money you can donate to people, so that's also like $1 million, $2 million to run our state rep rates. Like we have good laws in place. They weaken them from time to time, but we still have good laws in place to make running for office relatively affordable in Massachusetts.
And I think what this reminds us of as well is that there's been especially with the rise of small dollar fundraising that has come with, let's say, platforms like ActBlue, as well as the nationalization of a number of races, and the intention that both in like earned media and social media for races, there's a natural tendency from a number of people to funnel their money to the same exact candidate, which ends up warping the playing field on the national space, where like I would just think, for instance, that when people were giving so much money to, let's say, Jamie Harrison running against Lindsey Graham, or why am I blanking out of the name of the woman running against Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, that candidates who face very, very, very steep odds, and it's still like people who are donating to the challengers to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who face in a district that's like 80% Republican. And there's value, and you can run that campaign that's never going to win in a way that builds infrastructure, but that's not really why people are donating, because they're donating because they care about the person that they're running against. But your money is so much more valuable in other races, rather, because especially if everybody is donating to one race because it's the center of attention, when there are a number of smaller races where your money goes much further, that actually can have a very significant impact.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Your money is going to go way, way further in state politics than it's ever going to go in national politics. Way further. Dozens, hundreds of times further. It's crazy. Crazy. So I would love to hear stories about national policies here or in other countries that started by passing at the state level.
You should go first.
Oh, well, I was gonna say, like, a number of labor law, like a lot of labor law in the US, like I think, like, wasn't Jordan, you had mentioned before, looking at stuff within like the progressive era, but stuff around I think Wisconsin had done a lot of that early on, or a number of other states where there were things like unemployment insurance being done at the state level here before it became national, or different labor protections like child labor, like banning child labor, or minimum wage laws, things like that. A lot of that activity coming up around the turn of the century, early 1900s, about when people saw like how unchecked kind of industrial capitalism was getting in the US, and like we need to put some limits on that. And a lot of that action began at the state level before it filtered up to the national level, when people were thinking about both what are the kind of restrictions on the companies themselves, and what are the protections that need to be granted to the workers, and to like consumer safety laws that had passed then, or like consumer safety laws, like food or consumer protection laws and food safety laws, to make sure that people weren't giving you like things filled with sawdust or poisoned water. But a lot of that a lot of that action ended up being kind of at the state level. And I can even think in terms of like healthcare policy began at the state level before it was a national thing. And I remember even reading back years ago about when New York State studies back around like the 19 teens about what it would look like, about what health insurance policies that they should be passing at the state level. That since for something to reach the point of national policy, it typically has to come from somewhere. Or even as like Jordan noted before, in terms of things that began with the states, like the right extending the franchise.
Yep, exactly. I mean, anything that we could think of that's important over time has come from the state level first, right? So, yep, everything from, I mean, even just if you think about like how we had free states and not free states, right? Those are state policies that get passed, and we think of them as just things that happened, but they aren't things that happened. They were campaigns that activists and organizers organized their local people to pass laws to make it so that it was illegal once it was legal to enslave people, right? Massachusetts passed a law that activists made happen, that happened at the state level to start creating this cascade of free states. That was a change. So, the reaction of re-enslavement and some of those things, those are reactions to the activists who are active during this time to end that thing. Same with the right to vote, right? The franchise, we open it up, it goes state by state, allowing women, allowing Black people to vote. That's a state thing that happens first. You're talking New York, Wyoming, right? Like these are places that are doing it. So we think of, because we teach history as things happened and not lots of people, incredible people who are no different from you or I, organized to make it happen, we forget that these things happen. But and on top of all the things from labor laws being state by state, as Jonathan said, absolutely, right? All of those protections, these are all, progressive era, right? Or late 1800s, early 1900s reforms. These are all passed at the state before they get picked up nationally. And in fact, Teddy Roosevelt, who's famously the progressive president, he's picking up these things from his time on the state level, right? Like, it's not just that he was a governor and then became president. It's that the policies that he was pushing in the states made it popular for him to run for president because he was doing it at the state level. And funny enough, if he hadn't been, if somebody hadn't died and he became president, they were actually worried about him being president because of all the stuff they had done at the state to curb the influence of business and to support like sort of regular people, right? It was the state action that was the problem. So, you know, and then if we think about Medicare for all, you know, famously in Canada, right, it starts in a province, a state province passes it. You know, in England, it starts with a program of a couple of hospitals, right? It starts locally for them and builds out to a national system. People felt comfortable with a national system because they had already experienced it or seen some form of it being tested out in local ways, right? People are averse to change, especially politicians are not leaders, they are representatives, elected representatives. They can only get so far out. So the work of us is to build momentum so that it becomes inevitable that these things happen. FDR is passing things to stave off communism in America. Not passing, and he's borrowing legislation and ideas that are popping up. He's not creating these ideas himself, right? Some of these big reforms are things that are bouncing around in, you know, they're bouncing around America at the time, and they're bouncing around the states.
Yep, absolutely.
I just want to kind of especially emphasize that last point you made, that a lot of the times where some of the best steps forward happen in the US, it's often politicians doing things that are good to stave off something that might have actually been better, but by people pushing for the thing that was better, they were able to like kind of create the pressure that moved things forward. And I think that there's often a tendency in politics to assume, well, let's ask for what we think that we can get. And that ends up kind of losing sight of the fact that you always want to, that it's valuable to ask for more to shape that perspective of what you could end up with. Because you don't ask for what you're willing to settle for, because you'll probably get less.
You're going to get way less than that. Okay, our final question of the day is why, when a lot of times I talk to people in Massachusetts, I talk to people in other states, and they're like, well, sure, that's all important, but like, I'm not going to work in Massachusetts. Like, I'm going to work in Texas, where these, you know, or Oklahoma, where terrible things are happening. I'm going to do something in, you know, Florida, because they're passing these terrible laws. And I want us to spend a whole episode on this, because I think this question is a deep one. But just a little tiny segment for today, which is that, you know, we have the opportunity here in Massachusetts because our population wants this stuff. So we don't have to fight an uphill battle of like building progressive momentum when you know, 60% of the people who live here are Republicans, right? We could actually pass these things, right? There's so little in our way that this is the place where we can pass these policies and lead the country, be the one that is proving that it can work.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, one thing I want to note that I think is especially valuable of making changes where some of the barriers aren't there is about the issue of political, like the term political efficacy of people's belief that they can actually make change by engaging with the political process. And I think is about there that it's something that I think is quite weak in the US compared to other countries, because people see like about how terrible things are and how often they don't change, and they get disillusioned, and so they don't think that they can meaningfully have an impact by if they engage at all. And if you do actually show that creates a way of boosting people's belief in what's possible in other places, as well as at least chipping away, even if slightly, at the belief that government can't do things.
Yeah,
because the belief that like, well, the government can't actually do that, or that's not going to work, is one of the easiest first reasons to oppose something, or to oppose even trying it. And if you can demonstrate that it does, it's actually it's something valuable to all of those other states, even more so than one's own like key phone calls here and there, which you can still do, as long as you balance your time well.
Yeah, the way I like to talk about it is, imagine you're watching a football game, not the Puppy Bowl, football, okay? Imagine you're watching a football game and your team is the blue team and their team is the red team. And, you know, the red team like pushes down the field, pushes down the field, pushes down the field, and the blue team doesn't do anything until the red team is on the blue team's 10-yard line, till they're about to score. And then suddenly the blue team is like, oh, we got to do something, you know? But like, if you're never getting to the point of maybe scoring or of actually scoring, of actually passing the policies we need, how often are your fans going to want to come back? How often are they going to get up and cheer? I mean, we got to think about what actually creates democracy. It's people believing that their government can and does work for them. And if we're never willing to work in a state like ours, where we could totally pass these things, and where the people agree with us, if we're never willing to fight that fight and we're never willing to score those goals, people are going to check out and go home. Why are all the anti-abortion people, which is a tiny fraction of the American population, why are they super excited and like gung-ho, voting every single time and, you know, working their butts off? Because they are winning. They're seeing their policies get passed, state after state, and now with the Supreme Court. So we've got to engage people by winning.
Yeah. And I just want to say finally too, because I get always frustrated with this thing that people say like, well, Massachusetts isn't that blue. And I sort of like, it's a complicated question. That's a complicated thing to say, like, what do people believe? People believe lots of conflicting things that aren't easily definable into ideological places and policies. But we are that blue. Like, Massachusetts has a rural population that's to the left of many of its urban centers. There's not a lot of places in America where that's true. You don't go out to rural Kansas and find lefties the way you do in the Berkshires, right? Like, it's just not happening. We have population, we have people of, we have, you know, by and large, the white folks in Massachusetts, while they obviously we swim in a soup of racism, right? They are not buying a lot of the, you know, sort of conservative selling of white racial animus. They're just not buying it at the levels that people are buying it in South Carolina or Georgia or other places where we're trying to swim upstream and eke out a victory here or there, right? There is opportunity. Now, that is complicated. It is not a simple, straightforward. People believe lots of conflicting things. They will vote for Baker and oppose Trump and not think anything about it, right? Like, it's not a simple one for one for people, like the way the media or other people try to portray it. But there is opportunity here. And the biggest opportunity is that in the imaginations of Massachusetts residents is a state that led the revolution, that led on slavery, that led on civil rights, that birthed some of the best, and it's true, birthed some of the best things about America: religious freedom, racial, a fight for racial equity,
Labor
right,
laws.
like labor laws. These are in the imaginations. They're in the DNA of Massachusetts. And we are missing an opportunity to tap into that and mobilize that belief systems towards real change that makes people's lives better. And that's the piece that I think of. Yes, you can mobilize the same people towards regressive beliefs. People hold lots of conflicting ideas, but we can and should be mobilizing people on these big ideas for change.
And one quick thing before we close out, Jordan, your point reminds me of the thing I think is often interesting in Massachusetts is it's one of the rare states where you can actually invoke how the state sees itself when advocating for things. It's kind of in the way that people can do that nationally, where you invoke this kind of American idealism in advancing policies. That, like, coming from like Pennsylvania, or let's say thinking of like less than an hour away from my rep in Jersey, nobody like really invokes. Like, you maybe only get that in Pennsylvania if you're in a room with Quakers and they're somehow calling us a Quaker dimension of that, but even then that's probably stretched. And a lot of states don't have that. And it's actually a useful thing of that kind of rhetorical reserve and like an ideological reserve to be able to pull from when talking about things.
If you can do it anywhere, if you can do it here, then we should be able to do it here. If you get anywhere, we should be able to do it here. I think I got that backwards. Great. Well, everybody, thanks so much for everybody for listening. Thanks so much to those people who donated after our last podcast. And please look at the links below to donate for this podcast. You'll notice two of us now have new beautiful podcast microphones. And we have new graphics. We have an editor. We're really making things happen and getting this out into people's ears and eyes and brains. So share it with your friends, share it with your family, donate to the show. And thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.